Chapter 6. The Fair Lands of the South Seas. Rutiaro. Chance began to move of set purpose in Papeete on the day I was to sail with the 110-ton schooner Caleb S. Winship for the Cloud of Islands. I was on my way to the waterfront, and, having plenty of time, walked leisurely, thinking of the long journey so nearly at hand, of the strange and lonely islands I was to see, and wondering, as an Anglo-Saxon must when presented with a piece of good fortune, what I had done to merit it. Oro, the cabin boy of the Winship, was following with my luggage. He kept at some distance, a mark of respect, as I thought, until I saw him sublet his contract to a smaller boy. Then he retired to spend the unearned increment in watermelon and a variety of cakes sold at the Chinese stalls along the street. Not wanting him to think that I begrudged him his last little fling on shore, I became interested of a sudden in the contents of a shop window, and there I saw a box full of marbles. In a moment Oro was forgotten. Papeete faded from view, and the warm air, fragrant with the odors of vanilla and roasting coffee, became more bracing. There was a tang in it, like that of early April in Iowa, for example, at the beginning of the marble-playing season. 15 years dropped lightly from my shoulders, and I was back at the old rendezvous in the imagination, almost as really as I had ever been in the flesh. The lumber yard of S. M. Brown and Son lay on the right hand, and the Rock Island Railroad tracks on the left. Between, on a stretch of smooth cinder right-of-way, a dozen games were in full swing. There were cries of picks and vents, bunchers, sneakers, knucks down, the sharp crack of expert shots, the crunch of cinders under bare and yet tender feet. Meadow larks were singing in a nearby pasture, and from afar I heard the deep whistle of the Rocky Mountain Limited as it came down the Mitchell grade. I bought the marbles, the whole box of them. They cost 50 francs, about $4 American, as the exchange was then, but I considered the investment a good one. I knew that no matter where I might be, to lift the lid of my box was to make an immediate and inexpensive journey back to one of the pleasantest periods of my boyhood. Oro was awaiting me at the quay, and carried my small sea-chest on board with an air of spurious fatigue. I gave him my purchase, and told him to stow it away for me in the cabin, which he did with such care that I did not find it again until we were within view of Rutiaro. The Caleb S. Winship was homeward bound then. From Tano, where we had left Crichton, the English planter, Rutiaro lying on our course, it was decided to put in there, in the hope that we might be able to replace our lost deck cargo of copra, washed overboard in a squall a few days previously. Neither Findlay's South Pacific Directory nor the British Admiralty's sailing directions had much to say about the atoll. Both agreed that the lagoon is 9 miles long by 5 broad, and that on June 29th, 1887, the French surveying vessel St. Etienne found the tide running through a narrow pass at 2 knots per hour, the flood as swift as the ebb. It was further stated that in 1889 Her Majesty's ship Prince Edward anchored in 8 fathoms, 300 yards from shore, in front of the village, which is situated on the most westerly island, and from that a few pigs and chickens were purchased at a nominal price from the inhabitants. With this information I had to be content in so far as my reading was concerned. There was nothing of a later date in either volume, and the impression I had was that the atoll, having been charted and briefly described, had remained unvisited, almost forgotten, for a period of 31 years. This, of course, was not the case. Tinned beef and kerosene oil had followed the flag there as elsewhere in the world. Religion, in fact, had preceded it, leaving a broad wake of Bibles and black Mother Hubbards still in evidence among the older generation. But skippers of small trading schooners are rarely correspondents of the hydrographic associations, and the reports from the field of itinerant missionaries are buried in the dusty files of the religious journals, so that Rutiaro is as little known to the world at large as it has always been. Findlay's general remarks about it were confined to a single sentence: a lonely atoll, numbering a population of between 75 and 100 inhabitants. It certainly looked lonely enough on the chart, far out on the westerly fringe of the archipelago, more than 600 miles from the nearest steamship route, and that one infrequently traveled. I sought further information from Tino a Tino, the supercargo, a three-quarters American despite his Tahitian name. He had been trading in the Low Islands for 20 years, and during that time had created a voluminous literature with reference to their inhabitants. But it was all of an occupational nature and confined to the ledgers of the Inter-Island Trading Company. I found him at his usual task in the cabin, where he gave me some specimen compositions for criticism. "I wish you'd look them over," he said. "These copra bugs drive a man wild. They get in your eyes, in your liquor, in your mouth. Lord, what a life!" The cabin was filled with unsacked copra to the level of the upper tier of bunks. One had to crawl on hands and knees. The copra bugs were something of a nuisance, and the smell and heat oppressive. I had traveled on more comfortable vessels with tennis courts on the boat decks and Roman swimming baths below, but they didn't touch at Rothario. I went through his accounts, verifying long list of items such as: to Taritutu, DR, 1 dozen beacon lanterns at 480 francs, 480. To Uhaiti Punce, DR, 12 sacks lily dust flour at 300 francs, 3600. To Lohongchen, DR, 1 gross Night King flash lamps at 3600 francs, 3600. The work of checking up finished, we went out for a breath of air. The atoll lay abeam, and still far distant a faint bluish haze lifted a bare eighth of an inch above the circle of the horizon. Behind us, rain fell in a straight wall of water from a single black cloud which cast a deep shadow over the path we had come. Elsewhere the sky was clear, and the sea the incredible blue of the tropics. Tino broke a long silence. "Look here," he said. "What is it that interests you in these islands? I have never known anyone to visit them for pleasure before. Is it the women, or what?" Under pressure I admitted that nature seemed to have spent her best effort among the Paumotians in fashioning the men. "You're right," said Tino. "The women are healthy enough, of course, but they don't set your heart beating 100 to a minute. They have fine hands and white teeth, and you won't find such black hair in all the world as you'll find in these atolls. But that's the size of it. You can't praise them any further for looks. Maybe you haven't noticed their ears, because they always cover them up with their hair. But they're large, and their feet and ankles tough as sole leather, and all scarred over with coral cuts. That is well enough for the men, but with the women it's different. Makes you lose your enthusiasm, don't it?" I had seen a good many striking exceptions in our wanderings, but I had agreed in the main. What he said was true. "Well, if it ain't the women, what else is there to be interested in? Not the island themselves. Lord, when you've seen one, you've seen the lot. Living on one of them is like living aboard ship. Not room to stretch your legs. They're solid enough, and they don't sink. But in a hurricane, I'd a heap rather take my chances out to sea with the Winship than to be lashed to the stoutest coconut tree in the whole group. Now you take Rothario. It was washed over 17 years ago, and all but 20 of the people killed. They are back to 75 now, but wait till the next bad blow down the way. They'll drown like rats, just as they did before. Well, we don't have to stop long," he added grouchily. "I'll take what copra they have and get out. It's a God-forsaken hole. They only make about 25 tons a year. The island could produce 3 times that amount under decent management. They're a lazy, independent lot at Rothario. You can't get 'em to stir themselves." I asked him what they had to gain by stirring themselves. "Gain?" he said. "They have everything to gain. There are 2 frame houses on the place. The rest of them are miserable little shelters of coconut thatch. I haven't sold them enough corrugated iron in 10 years to cover this cockpit. You remember Takura and Niue and Faery? Well, there's my idea of islands. Nice European furniture, iron beds, center tables, phonographs, bicycles. A further catalogue of the comforts and conveniences of civilization which the inhabitants of Retiaro might have and didn't, convinced me that this was the atoll I had been looking for, and I regretted that our stay here was to be so brief. I did not begrudge the inhabitants of richer atolls their phonographs and bicycles. They got an incredible amount of amusement out of them, listened with delight to the strange music, and spent entire evenings taking turns with the bicycles, riding them back and forth from the lagoon beach to the ocean shore. But the frame houses were blots on the landscape, crude barn-like structures, most of them which offended the eye like factory chimneys in a green valley. Rutiaro had none of these things, and having no interest in it from the commercial point of view, I awaited impatiently our arrival there. At 10 o'clock we were 3 miles to windward of the village island. It lay at the narrower end of the lagoon, the inner shore line curving around a broad indentation where the village was. The land narrowed in one direction to a ledge of reef. At the further end there was a small motu, not more than 300 yards in length by 100 broad, separated from the main island by a strip of shallow water. Seen from aloft, the two islands resembled roughly in outline an old-fashioned, high-pooped vessel with a small boat in tow. I could see the whole of the atoll from the mainmast crosstrees, the lagoon shimmering into green over the shoals, darkening to an intense blue over unlit valleys of ocean floor, a solitude of sunlit water, placid as a lake buried in the depths of inaccessible mountains. I followed the shoreline with my glasses. Distant islands, ledges of barren reef, leaped forward with an effect of magic, as though our atom of a vessel, the only sail which relieved the emptiness of the sea, had been swept in an instant to within a few yards of the surf. Great combers, green and ominous looking in the sunlight, broke at one rapidly advancing point, toppled and fell in segments, filling the inner shadows with a smother of foam. Beyond it lay the broad fringe of white, deserted beach, the narrow forest of shrubs and palm, the empty lagoon, a border of misty islands on the further side. I had seen the same sort of a picture 20 times before, always with the same keen sense of its desolate beauty, its allurement, its romantic loveliness. Tino had said, "When you've seen one, you've seen them all," and an old skipper once told me that the atolls are as much alike as the reef points on that sail. It is true. They are as monotonous as the sea itself, and as fresh with varying interest. The village was hidden among the trees, but I saw the French flag flying near a break in the reef, which marked the landing place for small boats. Further back, a little knot of people were gathered, some of them sitting in the full glare of the sun, others in the deep shade, leaning against the trees in attitudes of dreamy meditation. 3 girls were combing their hair, talking and laughing in an animated way. They were dressed in all their European finery, gowns of flowered muslin pulled up around their bare legs to prevent soilure. A matronly woman in a red wrapper had thrown the upper covering aside and sat naked to the waist, nursing a baby. I put down my glasses, feeling rather ashamed of my scrutiny, as though I had been peeping through a window at some intimate domestic scene. The island leaped into the distance. The broad circle of foam and jagged reef narrowed to a thread of white, and the Caleb S. Winship crept landward again under a light breeze, an atom of a ship on a vast and empty sea. 8 bells struck, a tinkling sound, dead and scarcely audible in the wide air. I heard Tino's voice as though coming from an immense distance. "Hello, up there! Carry Con's ready," I said. "All right, I'm coming," and was surprised at the loudness of my own shout. But I waited for a moment to indulge myself in a last reflection. It is 31 years since the Prince Edward put in here. Excepting a few traders and missionaries, there isn't probably one man in 100,000 who has ever heard of this atoll, not one in a million who has ever seen it, or ever will see it. What a piece of luck for me! Then I saw Oro at the galley door with a huge platter of boiled beef and sweet potatoes. The sight of it reminded me that I was very hungry. As I climbed down to the deck, I was conscious of the fact that a healthy appetite and a good digestion were a piece of luck, too, and that as long as one could hold it, the lure of islands would remain, and one's love of living burn with a clear flame. Jack the monkey seemed to divine my thought, to agree with it. As Oro, the food-bearer, passed him, he reached down from his perch in the rigging, seized the largest sweet potato on the platter, and clambered out of reach. Assured of his safety, he fell to greedily looking out wistfully toward the island. The pass was at the further end of the lagoon, and in order to save time in getting the work ashore under way, the supercargo and I, with 3 of the sailors, put off in the whaleboat to land on the ocean side of the village. Half a dozen men rushed into the surf, seized and held the boat as the backwash poured down the stern incline at the edge of the reef. Among them was the chief, a man of huge frame, 6 foot 2 or 3 in height. Like the others who assisted at the landing, he was clad only in a pareu, but he lost none of his dignity through his nakedness. He was 55 years old, as I afterward learned, and as he stood bidding us welcome, I thought of the strange appearance certain of the chief men in America or France or England would make under similar circumstances. Deprived of the kindly concealment of clothing, what a revelation it would be of skinniness or pudginess! What an exhibition of scrawny necks, fat stomachs, flat chests, flabby arms! To be strictly accurate, I had seen some fat stomachs among elderly Paumotuans, but they were exceptions, and always remarkable for that reason, and those who carried them had sturdy legs. They did not give one the uneasy feeling common at home at the sight of the great paunches of sedentary men toppling unsteadily along a strip of crimson carpet from curb to curb doorway. Wherever one goes in Polynesia, one is reminded, by contrast, of the cost physically to men of our own race of our sheltered way of living. There on every hand are men well past middle life, with compact, symmetrical bodies and the natural grace of healthy children. One sees them carrying immense burdens without exertion, swimming in the open sea for an hour or 2 at a time while spearing fish, loafing ashore with no greater apparent effort for yet longer periods. Sometimes, when they have it, they eat enormous quantities of food at one sitting, and at others, under necessity, as sparingly as so many dyspeptics. It would be impossible to formulate from their example any rules for rational living in more civilized communities. The daily quest for food under primitive conditions keeps them alert and sound of body, so that, whether they work or loaf, feast or fast, they seem always to acquire health by it. There had been no boats at Retiaro in 5 months, and the crowd on the beach was unfeigningly glad to see us. The arrival of a schooner at that remote island was an event of great importance. The sight of new faces lighted their own with pleasure, which warmed the heart toward them at once. We had brought ashore a consignment of goods for Moy Ling, the Chinese storekeeper, and when the handshaking was over, they gathered around it as eagerly as a group of American children at a Christmas tree. Even the village constable seemed unconscious of any need for a show of dignity or authority. The only badge of his office was a cigarette-card picture of President Poincaré, fastened with a safety-pin to his old felt hat. He neglected his duties as a keeper of order, and was one of the most excited of Moy Ling's helpers with the cargo. He kept patting him affectionately on the back, saying, "Motoi, motoi," which in that situation may be as freely translated as, "You know me, Moy Ling." And the old Chinaman smiled, the pleasant, non-committal smile of his countrymen the world over. Tino's was the only sour face on the beach. He moved through the crowd, giving orders, grumbling and growling, half to himself and half to me. "I told you they were a lazy lot," he said. "They've seen us making in for 3 hours, and what have they been doing? Loafing on the beach, waiting for us instead of getting their copra together. Moy Ling is the only one in the village who is ready to do business. 5 tons, all sacked for weighing. He's worth a dozen Kanakas. Well, I'll set 'em to work in quick time now. You watch me. I'm going to be loaded and out of here by 6 o'clock." But chance, using me as an innocent accomplice, ordered it otherwise. It was Sir Thomas Browne who said, "Those who hold that all things are governed by fortune had not erred had they not persisted there." He may be right, although I don't remember now where his own non-persistence lay. But there are some things, some events, which chance of fortune, whatever one wishes to call it, governs from the outset with an amazing show of omnipotence. Tracing them back, one becomes almost convinced of a fixed intent, a far-sighted, unwavering determination in its apparently haphazard functioning. It is clear to me now that because I had been fond of playing marbles as a boy, I was to be marooned 15 years later on a fragment of land 6,000 miles from the lumber yard of S. M. Brown & Son. Tino had no more to do with that result than I did. He merely lost his temper because chance disorganized his plans for an early departure, tried to quench his anger in rum, and because, more furious still because he was drunk, then off he went in the Caleb S. Winship, leaving me stranded ashore. I can hear his parting salutation, which he roared at me through a megaphone across the starlit lagoon. "You can stay." But this is anticipating. The story moves in a more leisurely fashion. As I have said, my box of marbles came to light again only a few hours before we reached Rutiaro. I took them ashore with me, thinking they might amuse the children. They had a good knowledge of the technique of shooting, acquired in a two-handed game common among the atolls, which is played with bits of polished coral. But theirs had always seemed to me a tame pastime, lacking the interest of stakes to be won or lost. I instructed them in the simple rules of bull ring and Tom's dead, which they quickly mastered. Then I divided the marbles equally among them and gave them to understand that the winner held his gains, although marbles, like trade goods, might be bartered for. I emphasized that feature of the game because of a recollection remaining from my own marble-playing days, of the contempt in which boys were held who refused to hazard their marbles in a test of skill. They refused to play for keeps, and the rest of us had nothing to do with them. The youngsters of Rutiaro were not of that stamp. They took their losses in good part. When I saw that, I left them to themselves, and went for a walk through the village. I knew, at least I thought I did, that our stay was to be brief, and I wanted to make the most of it. I followed the street bordering the lagoon, past the freshly thatched houses, with their entryways wide to the sun and wind, and came at length to a small burying-ground, which lay in an area of green shadow far from the village. There were a dozen or more graves within the enclosure, some of them neatly mounded over with broken coral and white shell, others encased in a kind of sarcophagus of native cement to keep more restless spirits from wandering abroad. Most of them were unmarked. 2 or 3 had wooden headboards, one of which was covered with a long inscription in Chinese. Beneath this the word "Repose" was printed in English, as though it had some peculiar talismanic significance for the Chinaman who had placed it there. It was the grave of a predecessor of Moy Ling's. I fell to thinking of him as I sat there, and all of the Chinamen I had met in the earlier days, lonely, isolated figures, most of them without family or friends, or the saving companionship of books. What was it that kept them going? What goal were they striving toward through lives which held so little of the comfort or happiness essential to the rest of humankind? Repose. A better end than that, surely. The air rang with the sound of the word. The garish sunlight fell pitilessly on the print of it. To most men, I believe, with the best of life still before them, there is something terrible, infamous, in the thought of the unrelieved blackness of an endless, dreamless sleep. I turned from the contemplation of it, let my thoughts wander in a mist of dreams, of half-formed fancies, which glimmered through consciousness like streaks of sunlight in a dusty attic. These vanished at length, and for a time I was as dead to thought or feeling as Moy Ling's predecessor, sleeping beside me. I was awakened by some one shaking me by the shoulder. A voice said, "Harry Tipati, come down to the boat," and a dark figure ran on before, turning from time to time to urge me to greater speed. It was almost night, although there was still light enough to see by. I remembered that Tino had told me to be at the copra sheds at 5. The tide would serve for getting through the pass until 8, but I hurried nevertheless, feeling that something unusual had happened. Rounding a point of land which cut off the view from the village and inner lagoon, I saw the schooner, about 300 yards offshore, slim and black against a streak of orange cloud to the northward. She was moving slowly out, under power. The whaleboat was being hoisted over the side, and at the wheel I saw the familiar silhouette of the supercargo. I shouted, "Hi, Tino, wait a minute! You're not going to leave me behind, are you?" A moment of silence followed. Then came the answer with the odd deliberation of utterance which I knew meant Tahiti rum. "You can stay there and play marbles till hell freezes over. I'm through with you." What had happened, as nearly as I could make out afterwards, was this. My box of marbles, which I had brought ashore for the amusement of the children, interested the grown-ups as well, particularly the hazard of stakes in the game I had shown them. Paumotians have a good deal of Scotch acquisitiveness in their make-up. They coveted these marbles. They were really worth coveting, and it was not long until play became general, a family affair, the experts in one being pitted against those in another, regardless of age or sex. Tino's threats and entreaties had been to no purpose. All work had come to an end, and the only copra which got aboard the Winship was Moy Ling's 5 tons, carried out by the sailors themselves. Evidently, Faery, the chief, had been one of the most enthusiastic players. He was not a man to be bulldozed or browbeaten. He had great dignity and force of character, for all his boyish delight in simple amusements. What right had Tino to say that he should not play marbles on his own island? He gave me to understand, by means of gestures, intonation, and a mixture of French and Paumotian, that this was what the supercargo had done. At least apparently Tino had sent Oro on an unsuccessful search for me. He thought, I suppose, that, having been the cause of the marble-playing mania, I might be able and willing to check it. Balked there, he went on board in a fit of violent temper, and had not been seen again, although his voice was heard for an hour thereafter. Of a sudden anchor was weighed, and I was left, as he assured me, to play marbles with the inhabitants of Rachino for an impossibly long time. Most of these details I gathered afterward. At the moment I guessed just enough of the truth not to be wholly mystified. The watery sputtering of the Winship's 25-horsepower engine grew faint. Then, with a ghostly gleam of her mainsail in the starlight, she was going. I was thinking, by Jove, I wouldn't have missed this experience for all the copra in the cloud of islands. I was glad there were still adventures of that sort to be had in a humdrum world. It was so absurd, so fantastically unreal, as to fit nothing but reality, and the event of it was exactly what I had wanted all the time without knowing it. There was no reason why I shouldn't stop at Rotario. To be sure, I was shortly to have met my friend Nordhoff at Papeete, but our rendezvous was planned to be broken. We were wandering in the South Pacific as opportunity and inclination should direct, which, I take it, is the only way to wander. For a few moments I was so deeply occupied with my own thoughts that I was not conscious of what was taking place around me. All the village was gathered there, watching the departing schooner. As she vanished, a loud murmur ran through the crowd, like a sough of wind through trees, a long drawn-out Polynesian "Aye," indicative of astonishment, indignation, pity. Paumotian sympathies are large, and I had been the victim of treachery, they thought, and was silently grieving at the prospect of a long exile. They gathered around, patting me on the back in their odd way, expressing their condolences as best they could. But I soon relieved their minds on that score. Then Faery, the constable with the cigarette-card insignia, pushed his way through with the first show of authority I had seen him make. "I've been Frisco," he said. with an odd accent on the last syllable. He had made the journey once as a stoker on one of the mail boats. Then he added, "You go to hell me," his eyes shining with pride that he could be of service as a reminder of home to an exiled American. He was about to take charge of me in view of his knowledge of English, but the chief waved him away with a gesture of authority. I was to be his guest, he said, at any rate for the present. He began his duties as host by entertaining me at dinner at Moyling's store. I was a little surprised that we did not go to his house for the meal until I remembered that the Chinaman had received the only consignment of exotic food left by the Winship. Faery ordered the feast with the discrimination of a gourmet and the generosity of a sailor on shore leave for the first time in months. We had smoked herring for hors d'oeuvres, followed by soup, curried chicken and rice, edible birds' nests flavored with crab meat from China, and white bread. For dessert we had small Chinese pears preserved in vinegar, which we ate out of the tin. Woman brand pears, the label said. There was a colored picture on it of a white woman in old-fashioned puff sleeves and a long skirt, seated in a garden, while a Chinaman served her deferentially with pears out of the same kind of a container. Underneath was printed in English, "These pears will be found highly stimulating. We respectfully submit them to our customers." That was the first evidence I had seen of China's bid for export trade in tinned fruit. Stimulating may have been just the word, but I liked the touch of Chinese courtesy which followed it. It didn't seem out of place, even coming from a canning factory. Faery gave all his attention to his food, and consumed an enormous quantity. My own appetite was a healthy one, but I had not his capacity of stomach. Furthermore, he ate with his fingers, while I was handicapped from the first with a two-pronged fork and a small tin spoon. I believe they were the only implements of the sort on the island, for the village had been searched for them before they were found. It was another evidence to me of the unfrequented nature of Retiaro, and of its slender contact even with this world of Papeete traders. At most of the islands we had visited, knives and forks were common, although rarely used except in the presence of strangers. The onlookers at the feast, about half the village, I should say, watched with interest my efforts to balance mouthfuls of rice on a two-pronged fork. I could see that they regarded it as a ridiculous proceeding. They must have thought Americans a strange folk, checking appetite and worrying digestion with such doubtful aids. Finally I decided to follow the chief's example, and set to with my fingers. They laughed at that, and Faery looked up from his third plate of rice and chicken to nod approval. It was a strange meal, reminding me of stories I had read as a boy of Louis XV dining in public at Versailles, with a room full of visitors from foreign courts looking on, whispering behind fans and lace cuffs, exchanging awestruck glances at the splendor of the service, the richness of the food, and the sight of majesty fulfilling a need common to all humankind. There was no whispering among the crowd at the Chinaman's shop, no awestruck glances other than Moy Ling's at the majesty of Faery's appetite. I felt sorry for him as he trotted back and forth from his outdoor kitchen, bringing in more food, thinking of his depleted stock, smiling with an expression of wan and worried amiability. Louis XV would have given something, I'll venture, for that old Paumotu chief's zest for food, for the kingly weight of bone and muscle which demanded such a store of nourishment. He pushed back his chair at length with a sign of satisfaction, and a half-caste girl of 17 or 18 removed the empty dishes. Paumotu hospitality is an easy, gracious thing, imposing obligations on neither host nor guest. Dinner over, I told Faery that I wanted to take a walk, and he believed me. I was free at once, and I knew that he would not be worrying meanwhile about my entertainment. I would not be searched for presently and pounced upon with the dreaded, "See here, I'm afraid you are not having a good time," of the uneasy host. I was introduced to no one, dragged nowhere to see anything, free from the necessity of being amused. I might do as I liked, rare and glorious privilege, and I went outside, grateful for it, and for the cloak of darkness which enabled me to move about unobserved. It lifted here and there in the glow of supper fires or streak of yellow lamplight from an open doorway. I saw family groups gathered around their meals of fish and coconuts, heard the loud intake of breath as they sucked the Mai-Tai sauce from their fingers. Dogs were splashing about in the shallows of the lagoon, seeking their own supper of fish. They are a strange breed, the dogs of the atolls, like no other that I have ever seen, a mixture of all breeds, one would think, a weird blending of good blood and bad. The peculiar environment and the strange diet have altered them so that they hardly seem dogs at all, but rather semi-amphibious animals, more at home in the sea than on land. They are gentle-mannered with their masters and with strangers, but fierce fighters among themselves. I sat down behind a clump of bushes, concealed from the light of one of the smoldering supper fires, and watched a group of Rotarian dogs in their search for food. They had developed a sort of teamwork in the business, leaped toward the shore all together with a porpoise-like curving of their bodies, and were quick as a flock of terns to see and seize their prey. Returning from my walk, I found the village street deserted, and all the people assembled back of Moy Ling's shop. He was mixing bread at a table while one of the sons of his strange family piled fresh fuel on the fire under a long brick oven. It was a great event, the bread-making, after long months of dearth, and of interest to everyone. Mats were spread within the circle of the firelight. Faery was there with his wife, a mountain of a woman, seated at his side. She was dressed in red calico wrapper, and her long black hair fell in a pool of shadow on the mat behind her. She was a fit wife for a chief, in size, in energy, in the fire and spirit living in the huge bulk of flesh. Her laughter came in a clear stream which it was a delight to hear. There was no undertone of foreboding or bitter remembrance, and the flow of it, as light-hearted as a child's, heightened the merry-making mood of the others. There was a babble of talk, bursts of song, impromptu dancing to the accompaniment of an accordion and the clapping of hands. As I looked on, I was minded of an account I had read of the Paumotuans, in which they were described as a dour people, silent, brooding, and religious. Religious some of them assuredly are, despite a good deal of evidence to the contrary, and they are often silent in the dreamy way of remote island people whose moods are drawn from the sea, whose minds lie fallow to the peace and beauty of it. But dour and brooding is very far from the truth. I took a place among them as quickly as possible, for I knew by repeated experience how curious they are about strangers, and first meetings were usually embarrassing. Without long training as a freak with a circus, it would try any man's courage to sit for an hour among a group of Paumotuans while he was being discussed item by item. There is nothing consciously brutal or callous in the manner of it, but rather an unreflecting frankness like that of children in the presence of something strange to their experience. I knew little of the language, although I caught a word here and there which indicated the trend of the comment. It was not general, fortunately, but confined to those on either side of me. Two old grandmothers started a speculation as to whether or not I had any children, and from this a discussion rose as to which of the girls of Rotaro would be best suited as a wife for me. I was growing desperate when chance, the godfather of all wanderers, intervened again in my favor. Moy Ling's fire was burning brightly, and it occurred to several of the youngsters to resume their marble playing. I saw Perusi's face light with pleasure, and he was on his feet at once with his stake in the ring. Others followed, and soon all those who had marbles were in the sport. I understood clearly then how helpless Tino had been. I could easily picture him rushing from group to group, furious at the thought of his interest being neglected through such childish folly. Those marbles were more desirable than his flour and canned goods, which he stood ready to exchange for copra. The explanation of this astounding fact may have been that no one thought he would go off as he did, and tomorrow would do just as well for getting down to business. Since he had gone, there was an end of that. It was futile to worry about the lost food. Certainly it was forgotten during the great tournament which took place that evening. Moy Ling worked at his bread-making unnoticed. His fire died down to a heap of coals, but another was built, and the play went on. Faery was a splendid shot, in marble playing as in other respects, the best man of the village. But there was a slip of a girl who was even better. During the evening she accumulated nearly half of the entire marble supply, and at length these two met for a test of skill. It was a long drawn-out game. I had never seen anything to equal the interest of both players and spectators. Not even at Brown's lumber yard, when the stakes were a boy's most precious possessions, cornelian stone taws. No one thought of sleep except a few of the old men and women, who dozed off at intervals with their heads between their knees. The lateness of the hour, the bizarre setting for a game so linked with memories of boyhood, combined to give me an impression of unreality. I had the feeling that the island and all the people on it might vanish at any moment, and the roar of the surf resolve itself into the rumble of street traffic in some gray city. And though it were the very city where marbles are made, where in the length and breadth of it could there be found anyone who knew the use of them, with either the time or the inclination to play, I might search it street by street. To the soot-stained suburbs I might go on, to the green country, perhaps, visit all the old-time marble-playing rendezvous from one coast to the other, with no better success. And though I passed through 1,000 villages of the size of Rutiaro, could at evenings amusement be provided in any one of them for men, women, and children, at an outlay of $4 American, the possibility would not be worth considering. People at home live too fast in these days, and they want too much. I could imagine Tino, in a sober mood, giving a grudging assent to this. "But, man," he would have added, "I wish they had more of their marble-making enthusiasm at Rutiaro. I would put in here 3 times a year, and fill the Winship with copra to within an inch of the main boom every trip." Moy Ling had enough of it for the whole island, it seemed to me. His ovens were opened as the tournament came to an end, and for half an hour he was kept busy passing out crisp brown loaves and jotting down the list of creditors in his account-book. It must have been nearly midnight. The crowd began to disperse. Faery joined me, smiling ruefully, holding out empty hands. He had lost all of his marbles to a mite of a girl whom he could have put in his vest pocket, had he owned one. His wife teased him about it on the way home, laughed heartily at his explanation and excuses. They discussed the events of the day long after the other members of the household had retired to their mats on the veranda. At last I heard their quiet breathing, and a strip of light from the last quarter moon revealed them asleep, 2 massive heads on the same pillow. I lay awake for a much longer time, thinking of one thing and another, of my friend Crichton at Tanao, the loneliest atoll in the world, I should say, of the Winship far out to sea, homeward bound, with 140 tons of copra in her hold, of Tino with his fits of temper and his passion for trade, which blinded him to so much of the beauty and the joy of life. But after all, I thought, it is men like Tino who keep wheels turning and boats traveling the seas. If he were to die, his loss would be felt. There would be an eddy in the current of life around him. But men like Crichton or myself, we should go down in our time, and the broad stream would flow over our heads without a ripple to show where we had been, without a bubble rising to the surface to carry with it for a moment the memory of our lives. It was not a comforting thought, and I tried to evade it, but I realized that my New England conscience was playing a part in these reflections, and was not to be soothed in any such childish manner. "How much copra have you ever produced or carried to market?" it appeared to say. I admitted that the amount was negligible. "How do you mean to justify your presence here?" was the next question, and before I could think of a satisfactory answer, "What good will come of this experience, either to yourself or to anyone else?" That was a puzzler until I happened to think of Findlay's South Pacific Directory. I remembered that his information about Rutiaro was very scant. The general remarks confined, as I have already said, to a single sentence: a lonely atoll, numbering a population of between 75 and 100 inhabitants. As a sop to my conscience, it occurred to me that I might write to the publishers of that learned work, suggesting that, in the light of recent investigations, they add to that description, "fond of playing marbles." Chapter 7